So Natasha Hausdorff is now here with me in the studio. Now, you believe that one of the things that has been used against Israel, that an idea that has been formulated, is a growing concept that there is illegality in the way that Israel operates. And you see this as an abuse of international law. Do you want to introduce me to your idea?
Certainly, I'd be happy to. And I think actually it complements what we've just heard from Yasha in that international law and in particular a concept of lawfare, which has developed certainly over the last decade, is being used to supplement the agenda that we've just had unpacked for us. So lawfare is the abuse of law, often for political purposes, as in the case here. And where international law is concerned, it's unfortunately far more susceptible to being abused and being misrepresented for two reasons. One, it is more political in nature than, say, the domestic legal systems, which lawyers are well versed in. But the other, of course, is that it is in and of itself influenced by politics and by international relations. And this process, as I identified, is certainly nothing new. Even in 2011, there was an infamous op-ed by Mahmoud Abbas, the president still of the Palestinian Authority, in which he specifically called for the internationalisation of this conflict as a legal, not just a political matter. And that was the president of the Palestinian Authority's declaration of lawfare against the State of Israel. And he coupled that with an intention to bring claims against Israel in the international legal forums, the fora such as the UN Human Rights Council, such as the International Criminal Court, and most recently, the International Court of Justice. And the process of adopting lawfare through these different fora involves misrepresentations of facts, as we've been hearing throughout the coverage, but also, importantly, of law. And it's come to a crunch here in terms of the blatant misrepresentations of international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, that we've been witnessing over the last months.
Let's pause there for a moment. Let me tell you that as a politician, I used to be very frustrated by people telling me what international law was, because as far as I could see, it didn't exist. I mean, it wasn't written down, and it seemed to change a lot. And it seemed to be very susceptible to the interpretation of anyone who was telling you about it. So isn't that a fundamental difficulty, that international law is a pretty nebulous thing, and it's not surprising that different parties try to manipulate it for their own purposes?
So I would absolutely agree that the general literacy, so far as international law is concerned, is limited. But that doesn't mean that the law itself is lacking in clarity. If we look specifically at the law of armed conflict, of course, there's customary international law, which is, you might say, more nebulous, but the sources of international law in terms of treaties are pretty easily accessible. And the misrepresentations that we're seeing, I don't think can be excused on the basis that the law is unclear. So, for example, this suggestion that hospitals might maintain immunity when they are being specifically used by terror organisations, as in the case of the Shifa Hospital, a command and control centre, the notion that hospitals would maintain a sense of immunity is flatly wrong as a matter of international law in terms of custom.
How would I know that? What can you refer me to that would prove your point?
Well, that customary element is reflected in Article 13 of Additional Protocol 1, the Fourth Geneva Convention. And it's actually not considered to be a source that people or states need to sign themselves up to, because it's such a fundamentally acknowledged part of customary international law that if a building, a school, a hospital, or even an ambulance, in the context of the recent strikes that we've been seeing, is being used for military purposes, it loses its protection and it is a legitimate military target. And this is law in black and white. The fact that it's being misrepresented now is an abuse of international law, and I think it's problematic not just for the debate that we're seeing in terms of Israel. It's problematic because it devalues international law and it politicises international legal institutions, which mean that the only thing that they have going for them, which is a general sense of legitimacy, is being very quickly eroded.
And let's go back a little bit. There was this very provocative statement from Guterres at the United Nations that the Hamas attack had to be seen in the context of, I don't know whether he said 64 years of oppression or whatever. So How has the law been interpreted by, for example, Hamas over questions like occupation and blockades and so on?
There are two aspects to the question you've just asked. And if I can first deal with the position taken by the UN Secretary-General, I actually happen to agree with him on the basis that this has not happened in a vacuum, but it has happened in the context of grave breaches of international law by international bodies, including the United Nations. 3,000 people, Michael, don't get up one morning and decide it's a good day to slaughter Jews. This is as a result of brainwashing over 30 years, where the UN has played a significant role, contrary, one may think, to obligations under international law. UNRWA schools, which have taught for the last 30 years the curriculum of the Palestinian Authority, which exalt martyrdom, and that is, of course, coupled with the Palestinian Authority Pay for Slave programme, which Western democracies continue to fund, despite the fact that this policy, enshrined in Palestinian law, pays the salaries of terrorists. No matter what banner they coalesce under, the Hamas terrorists that infiltrated over the border included those of the Nusbach force that were being paid those stipends by the so-called moderates, the Palestinian Authority, on a monthly basis. And by all accounts, that's what facilitated their planning of this attack for 2 years, because they didn't have to work. So that's an important aspect of responsibility that the UN Secretary-General must own up to because of the continued funding and incentivisation of terror and the brainwashing which has facilitated these horrific atrocities. But to come on to the second aspect of your question, and this related to the question of
blockades and so on.
Absolutely. So where we're talking about a siege or blockade, in fact, the blockade on Gaza is recognised as entirely legitimate even by the United Nations, because even the UN cannot be blind to the reasons that Israel has instituted it, which are now being portrayed on our television screens, because Hamas has over 16 years turned Gaza into a terror base. And in terms of the other buzzwords that we've heard, occupation, no international lawyer with any credibility is making that case for Gaza, and there are serious problems with the application of that political term in the broader legal context in other places also.
Natasha, I'm so sorry to cut you off, but you've certainly made your points very eloquently, and I thank you very much, Natasha Hausdorff, for coming into GB News on a Sunday morning.